Hello, beautiful light-filled souls. My name is Tricia Barker, and I'm here with Robin Landsong to talk about her upcoming book and her two near-death experiences and her trip back to Africa. And there's so much we could get into, but I will let spirit move us in the way that it needs to move us. But hi, Robin. How are you today?
Good, good. So glad to talk with you again.
Yes, and I want to start with your book, if you don't mind. I heard some updates on Facebook that it's coming along and you're finishing those final drafts. How does it feel to get to the end of that project?
Oh, it's so great to be beyond first draft writing. And when I came back from Africa and had so much information and so much experience that happened there, I wrote another almost 40,000 words to the book. So
Wow.
it's taken me quite a bit to do that. And so then going through that process. So yeah, it's full length and it's at the stage where I sent it out to about 11 people and got feedback. And what's so interesting, and I'm so grateful, I really wanted to speak to a lot of different people. So my idea was to get feedback from a lot of people so that I finessed it in a way and made it so it worked for a lot of brain styles and a lot of reading styles. And just everybody catches something different. Everybody has a different part that they say, oh, this could be more clear, or, I didn't know what you're talking about there. And I purposely, because I'm so visionary and, work in energy and that's just normal to me, I purposely chose a lot of people who are very sensory and very tactile and grounded so that they would tell me, like, I have no idea what you're talking about here when I'm
Interesting.
talking near death experience. So that I'm so grateful for that feedback because then I can get it so that it speaks to them.
Yeah. And I have a lot of friends who, from graduate school and writing programs and different areas who have told them about your book, and they're not into near-death experiences, but they're like, oh my God, I'm going to read her book because, it's Africa, it's such a wild story. And it's just so they're interested for the memoir part of it more so than the near-death experience. So it's really, that's what I was going for, was those two crowds. And it's so great that you've got those two crowds. You've got the people who are really not going to pick it up for near death experiences and who are going to pick it up just for the story. And, you have that ability to reach them. Are you kind of excited about that possibility?
Yeah, and we probably should actually give a little summary of the story. But part of it too is I'm really excited in terms of, like you say, the spectrum of, like, there's the near death part of it, and then there's the war reconciliation part, and like reconciliation in Africa. And one night I was talking to my son in bed, and he said, well, who would you really want to write your forward? And I said, well, Desmond Tutu. And he said,
Mm.
well, call him.
Oh, isn't it great how kids think it's easy?
So I actually have a friend who has worked with them, and so she just gave me his phone number a little while ago. So
Oh my God.
we'll see.
Wow. Just, yeah, when you're just in that creative mode and you're just putting it out there, you never know what might come about. So
We will see.
yeah. So for those of us who are listening and haven't heard your story, I do want to get into that. I'm just personally excited about the book. So I wanted to ask a few things about that. But what would you tell beginning writers? This weekend, I talked with a woman who was thinking about writing her story, and she's a single mom, and she was like, do I do this? And she cares deeply about near-death experiencers, and she's considering doing it. I know that it's a hard journey, and I know it's a hard journey. So do you have any advice for people who want to write about their stories?
Start where it's interesting to you,
Yeah.
and start where it feels most passionate. So I was talking to somebody, and they said, well, I'll start here and then the good part will happen in the middle. And I said, nope, start at the middle. Start where it's interesting to you, because it is incredibly hard. I've been working on this for 9.5 years, and it has changed me to write this book. And it's unglamorous. It's a lot of hours at the computer, and you have to know why you're doing it. You have to have the drive. And so starting with, like, the nugget or the juicy part of the story is going to get you past that hurdle of, like, oh, why would I possibly spend this many hours of my free time? doing something like this.
In 9 years, I think that floors a lot of people. Like, I've been working on the beginning of my book in workshops probably for about that long, mainly because I start with accident and near-death experience. And I, workshopped it with so many people who are not into near-death experiences, because I was like, well, how do I communicate with, someone in the Marines, or how do I communicate with someone who's not into this subject? Because they do get, these near-death experiences do get housed in a certain section of a bookstore, the inspirational section. And I think I came back to reach this world. I don't know if you have that kind of mission too, but I want to reach the common person who's agnostic, the person who suffered trauma, the whole spectrum of people who are just looking for healing or looking for answers. And I'm sure you have a similar vision.
Yeah, and when I did a survey in the beginning when I was in the early stages of my writing, and I really, exactly what you're saying, I really want to include atheists, agnostics, people who don't have a spiritual practice, and that there's a fair amount of Christian writing, which is awesome, and I want to make sure that this speaks to non-Christians as well.
Yes, me too. The worldly kids of the world, but it's a fine balance to not offend people. And I just realized at some point I'm probably going to offend someone. That's just who I am. So, but someone else will like it. And however, I think you did I got to read a draft of Robin's book, and I think you did a really good job of walking that line of just really being in the moment and telling the story from this pure place. That was very lovely. So I'd like to begin really with wherever you would like to begin. So you want to start, mirror kind of where you started with the book and start in childhood?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I wrote it from a child perspective of just moment by moment what happened. And so it doesn't have interpretation in it. And so when I was 8 years old, I was living in the US on the East Coast, and I was with parents who were neglectful and abusive. And that exposed me to a lot of pedophiles and a lot of other unsafe adults. And so one of those adults spotted me as a child that I wasn't really being protected. I'm gonna cough for a second. And he chose to abduct me, and he took me out of the country. And lots of people have questions on that part. Keep in mind, it's 1977. It's post-Vietnam War. There isn't anything about the security checks that we have now since 9/11. And what's interesting too, that we just took my son, and they actually never asked for his ID. They asked for our passports, but they never asked for his ID, just for reference, even today.
Wow. Did you stop them and tell them, like maybe they should?
There was one guy who was very casual, and so I joked around with them. And so the guy looked at him, he said, "Do you know these people?" And my son said, "Yes." It was kind of funny, but I thought, even today, it's not as secure as we would think.
Yeah.
So as best as I can remember, he drugged me, and he actually put me in a duffel bag. And so I don't think I ever went through, I don't think I went through as person. I think I went through as his personal luggage that he carried with him. And since I was drugged, I can't know that for sure, but that's the best I can put together. When I became conscious, I was in a small apartment, and he was there, and I kind of came to figure out when we went outside that it was a military base, and he was in uniform. And so my life was in danger at every moment. He did assault me and break my ribs. It was actually a neighbor that saved him from basically killing me that way. And I was hospitalized, and no one stopped him from coming to get me at the hospital. So he just walked in, said he was my dad, and took me. And so he took me to a place where it was a market, and it was the first place I actually realized we were in Africa, because before on the military base I didn't actually see that many people of color, and in the market it was mostly Black, and that's the first time I realized we were in Africa. And so he actually abandoned me at that point. He gave me over to another man.
And that must have been so disorienting. I mean, first realizing that you're in another country, and then with these strangers who were not helpful, who were harmful and frightening. Like, do you remember just glimpses? Has it helped you recover some of the memory through writing about it?
The writing has been incredible to really bring it back. And that my first draft of the writing wasn't very much, volume or sequencing. It had a ton of gaps. And it's my husband, John, who has really, he interviewed me with open-ended questions. What were you wearing? What did you eat? What did their voice sound like? What was the landscape? Paint the picture for me. So the writing has been incredibly healing for me and really bringing it back.
Yeah, I feel like God works with us as we're writing when we're telling a story. Like, other people give us input, and that's almost like God working through us in the weirdest of ways. Like, okay, this needs to be revised. That things that you forget about. Two people have died, and then I had to revise their parts in the manuscript, and I realized, just in death, that those little changes needed to be made. And so it's amazing. I'm sure you found just like miraculous synchronicities along the way.
Right, right. And the forgiveness I've been able to get to through the writing process.
Yeah.
And part of the reason it's taken 9 years is because the first 4 years there had to be so much recall, so much bringing it from a suppressed place to a conscious place, and then working through the emotion. Because we were out to dinner one time and somebody said, "Oh, you must be a good writer." And my husband looked and said, "No, her first drafts are horrible." I had so much emotion about it. And so the writing was very traumatized and convoluted. And so that's why it's really taken this long to get it to be clear writing, is because I had to heal and get clear in myself before I could even write it clearly.
Interesting. So when you were in that market and you're lost in this foreign country with terrifying people, what were your thoughts? How did you feel?
So when he gave me over to this other man and then just drove away, it was incredibly mixed, because on the one hand, I just lost the worst, most dangerous enemy to me in the world. On the other hand, he was the only one who knew where I came from. And so I had this, at least a fantasy that he was going to be the one to get me back home. And so with him abandoning me, I thought, how am I ever going to get home now? Because I don't know the way. And so what happened next is I went with the new man, and he was Black African. And we got on an old bus and went a ways, and then the bus broke down, and we were all instructed to get off and walk. But I had broken ribs, I hadn't been fed, and I couldn't keep up. And so he also abandoned me. And what it's important to understand is this is 1977 in Rhodesia, that's now Zimbabwe, and it's the height of the Rhodesian War. And there's 3 factions, and one of them, the extremists, one of their tactics is to kill white children so that the white farmers will leave and that they can have their land back. So for me to be abandoned out in this rural area is a matter of hours for my survival, which I didn't know at the time. So a middle party soldiers picked me up and took me to a village that I'm assuming they think would be receptive to a white child. And also it was closer to the border to South Africa. And so these people took me in. It was a rural village, and they took me in.
And I remember when I read your manuscript, how terrified you were to begin to trust someone, but how beautiful it was to see real love. And that's the part of the manuscript where I was just bawling, like through that whole section where you're with these loving mothers and fathers who dance with joy and connection to the earth. And it was amazing. So that part of the book is powerful.
Right. And what's so profound for me in that part is I came from not having mothering. I did not have, my mother wasn't capable of that. And so that now I know that there's many African cultures that it's normal for them to mother a child that's not their biological child. That sometimes they will take their sister's child into their home and then raise them as their own. That's normal in many African cultures. So what's exceptional is that they did that for a white child during a war where it was very dangerous for them to have me. And what I understand now that I've gone back is they could have been accused of abducting me, which would have been a very serious crime. So it was a very big risk for them to take me in. and that they really brought me in with the singing and the ceremony, and it really just filled me up. I was so hungry, I was so broken, I was just like a wounded animal. And to have one of the women sing to me and then hold me into her arms, I literally just collapsed in her arms and just let her be my shelter and let her be my new mother.
And yeah, that's such an amazing part. And I also love the description of the dancing. And to me, I think from what I've read and experienced, just in Native American communities, there's a connection to the land that allows people to sing and dance and talk in a different way. And it sounds like you witnessed that type of connection.
And it really, even though I was only with them a relatively short time, I was abducted in June and I was back in the US by some time in August. It gave me this value of honoring the land and connecting to the land, because these were the first place I got parenting, the first place I got belonging. So the imprint it made on me about being part of the land, living off the land, feeling the ancestors in the land is a huge shaping of who I am in the world.
Yeah, I can understand that. Like I said, only glimpses, but right after my near death experience, I heard a shaman speak and I was just stunned, that I could feel the earth coming up through his words. And it was just this different way of speaking. And I thought, wow, it's so powerful. I mean, it's so incredibly powerful. So yes, I know what you mean. So you had this short, beautiful time with the people in this village, and then the first near death experience happened. So would you describe, I mean, it's like trauma on top of trauma, but would you describe that moment?
Mm-hmm. So I went to the creek and was playing by myself. And I looked up and there was a soldier, and he pulled out his rifle. And when the rifle became just a circle, then I knew I was done for. And in my heart, I was begging him, because to me, he looked just like the people who are taking such good care of me. And I couldn't understand why they would love me and he would hate me. And I was begging him to see with his original eyes, the ones that would see a child instead of the enemy, or the child of the enemy. So he pulled the trigger and the bullet grazed the top of my head and it blew me off my feet, and I started to die of blood loss. And what happened when I first crossed over is that I was greeted by two Black women, and they were young, and they felt like my two big sisters, and that they were there to greet me and to take care of me. And they gestured to a really big glowing orb, like a sphere. And I knew I could go into that and I would be fully restored, and that the sphere would never be diminished, that it could heal me and 1,000 people and it would never dim down. But I was so attached to that. I had just finally found family. And so I really wanted to stay with them. So I didn't want to go into the sphere. And that confusion sent me backwards and away from these two sisters and into a dark stairwell that looked kind of like a rainy day in Ireland.
And do you think that these sisters were former ancestors or just there in Africa, or did you have or angels, or did you have a sense of who they were to you?
I only just figured it out like a year ago, which is really funny. And so it'll require kind of foreshadowing of what happens next. So after I was shot, the soldiers came back and attacked the village. And I don't know if there's other survivors beyond me. There may or there may not be. But I think the two women who cared for me were part of the losses.
Mm.
And so that's a very interesting, that they were not yet dead, but I believe that's who greeted me during my death experience. So that kind of takes time and does something spherical with it that I can't quite explain.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was with them, and then I went through a dark cave where I really had to purify my self-blame about being abused, the part of me that thought something was wrong with me. That's why adults abused me. And my guide really helped me see that there was nothing wrong with me and that the abuse wasn't my fault. And we made it through that dark cave, and I went to a field, and there I met a being who he was had a beard and a robe with kind of long sleeves that was kind of felted material, wool, and he had a sheep herder staff. And in his presence, I felt no disturbance because I was still longing to get back to my African family. And when I was looking at trying to figure out who he was, his face changed to a lion. And then his face, and I thought, oh, I want to show this to Atto, who was one of the men in the village. And then his face changed to Atto. And so he was showing me it's not the form that matters, it's the connection. And then he leaned his forehead to mine, and I could see as he sees, which is that we're all connected by these living minds, like golden spider webs, and that in each of us there's a gem, sparkling gem. So I saw this huge matrix of all these gems, these living lines of connection, and that we can strengthen those living lines with our focus and our love. Mm-hmm. And then he brought his forehead back from mine, and my faith in him, my trust in him was so absolute that I just leaned my whole being into his. And we traveled, and we came out above the scene where I was, above the scene where I had died. And so the African woman who was like a mother to me, she had found my body, and she was stopping the blood flow, and she was wailing. And I wanted her to know I'm okay. I'm loved, I'm taken care of, I'm totally guided, I'm not in pain, and I'm just fine. And so I went further into the tunnel, and there was more beings that purified me, and I knew that I was going home. And home felt to me like, my words for it are the great heart. And that was the original place where I was sung into being, that I started as a sound sung by the great heart. And so I was going home to that place of origination, but I heard the song of my African mother, and I was in the tunnel, and I could go one direction to the great heart, but her song touched me, and she had called on the ancestors to join her in this calling song. And it was so pure that I stopped to listen. And when I listened, it awakened my memory that I hadn't done my purpose, which was to also be part of the medicine singers like she is. And that I too was to sing people to help them remember themselves. And that desire to live that purpose is what turned me around the tunnel. And I turned away from, going towards unification and total purity, and came back. And as I started coming back, I thought, I'm not sure I made the right choice. I'm getting pain, I'm getting body sensation, and I'm remembering what's back there. But I already made my choice, so it was like a river kind of moving me out. And so I came back to my body, and my African mother was like this great protector. I felt so fragile. And so they took care of me for many days, and I was starting to recover and be able to get up a little bit.
And did you have any memory of the near-death experience right away, or was it later that you remembered it? Like as soon as you were your head was beginning to heal, did you have little glimpses of what you'd experienced?
It's really so keep in mind I had a brain injury from that.
Yeah.
And so my memories of those couple of days is pretty sparse. Like I remember, them putting plants on me to heal the wound. And they also did singing prayer to get the hatred from the bullet off my head, so that I wouldn't go through life confused by that hatred.
Interesting.
But other than that and being fed, those couple of days are a little bit blank for me. And so what happened next is that the soldiers came back and attacked the village. And so one of the other mothers, I was in a hut with her, and when she thought everything was done, she grabbed me and started to run, and I was on her hip. And unfortunately, they were still there. And so the bullets came from the right side and hit her, and I was on her left side, so I was protected. And so she went down, and once I recovered from falling down with her, I thought, well, I have to drag her with me but she was yelling at me just to go. And she had never yelled at me before. And so I was totally torn, like, I'm 8, I'm very weak, I'm not sure I can pull her. And she was yelling at me and giving me this command to go. So I followed her command. And I ran, and I could only make it so far. My blood pressure, of course, was so low. And so I almost made it to the trees near the Limpopo River before I collapsed.
And I want to go back just briefly. You said something so interesting in that first near-death experience, that the divine could change forms. And that's something that a lot of people are curious about. And I just have this intuitive feeling that the divine meets us where we need to be met at that moment. You know, that what's going to give us what we need to move forward in our lives, or to feel safe, or to feel the learning that we need to feel in that moment, that's what we're met with. Is that how you make sense of the changing faces?
Yes, yes. And very much it being about purification, so I could accept the greater and greater levels of love. Because obviously when I first crossed over, I was still defended, and I still had so much self-blame and self-condemnation. And so they had to help me purify those so that I could even be ready to receive the magnitude of the love from the Great Heart.
And it's so interesting, the childhood near-death experiences, because they, like the child's mind accepts this other world pretty quickly in beautiful ways, but it also, these stories are generally a little more magical, I think, when I hear them from children. Like there's this quality, like of just super creativity, because maybe children are met with that kind of fun and creativity of, the changing faces and the different ways of feeling at home. And that's an interesting part of that. Like I didn't go through a lot of my childhood. I felt like a light was switched on, like it was kind of instant. It was like all that's left. So all that abuse, all that pain, just gone. And I saw I could just flip this switch, and the switch was this love that just washed it all away. Like it had, and that taught me that it had nothing to do with me. That it was really just the matter of a quick moment in the love of God that washed it away. So it's interesting that sounds like the child that you were got deeper lessons and deeper healing of that in the moment. And maybe because you had, and this is stepping ahead, but you had to go back home to those people. So maybe that's, that sustained you. But so we're getting to the second near-death experience, which is fascinating to me. So you fell at this point, and it appeared like you were dead. Is that correct? Or
which in now what I know after I've gone back and I found out a little bit more about what happened, ironically that saved my life. Because one, it meant they didn't shoot me again. And two, and this is a very kind of painful thing about African wars, is that some of the people, even after they were dead, the soldiers had machetes. So for me to be dead, face down, bleeding again, saved me from that. So in that, looking at things as divine grace and is, who knows the ways that we're being helped, even though it looks really awful in the moment. And so I crossed over and had an entirely different experience. It was a white and blank, and there was just a little horizon line, and there was a song being sung to me on that horizon line, and it was literally like Sesame Street, where the words "You will live," and there was actually, even just like Sesame Street, a blue bouncing ball. And so keep in mind, I really have a brain injury now, and I really need the blue bouncing ball to help me track. And so the song being sung to me, "You will live," and so it's to the rhythm of Three Blind Mice. And that was a very positive memory for me, because one time when I was sick, kind of the most loving thing my brother ever did to me was sit down when I was really sick and read me the whole set of Three Blind Mice. So whoever was speaking to me knew that that would increase my trust of them, because that was a very positive association for me. And so after, it took me quite a while to realize that it was a message to me: you will live. And then I got curious, who was speaking to me? And so when I was able to see through the veil, what I saw was a man, and he was His skin tone was kind of a very blue, purple blue. It was very beautiful, and I didn't really think it odd or anything. And he was jeweled, and he had black hair that was up in a bun on the top of his head. And so he kind of was feminine and masculine at the same time, but really intensely powerful. And it wasn't soft and loving like the experience I had with the man in the field, where I just felt completely embraced. It was intense. And I felt like he had the power to make a mountain with his hand and destroy the mountain 2 seconds later with his hand. And that I knew he was telling me I was going to live because he chose it as part of a greater cycle. And that if he wanted it that I was destroyed and made into a new form, that would be also. But he was choosing for me to live because there was some reason that that was going to help in some big cycle that I couldn't possibly understand. And his message to me is destruction makes available the ingredients for new creation. That we must break this apart, just like a mountain is made and then it comes down with erosion to make the beach. And you can't have the beach without the mountain being worn down. And so when I came back out of that experience, he was still with me, and he commanded me to move forward because I just wanted to give up. I had just lost everyone I loved. I felt absolutely horrible. I saw no way I was going to make it because I lost the people who took care of me. And he commanded me to move forward to the nearest well. Literally, I crawled for the whole rest of the evening until it was dark towards this well because he commanded me to move every inch forward. And the next day I was found by a woman from another village. And she washed me off and bundled me up and took me back to her homestead. And when people saw that she had a wounded white child, they said, "Don't bother with her. It's too dangerous." And she said, "She's a living human being. I'm not going to throw her away."
I want to stop and go back to that second near-death experience. Just one quick question. That seems very tied to nature too, that idea of creation and destruction. And I wonder if in retrospect you have more that I'm sure you have, like, meditated on that moment and why you think you needed that at that moment. I mean, obviously to just make it, to survive, you needed a certain strength, but I'd be curious, like, what your thoughts are about that moment.
So in hindsight, in the perspective I have now and the research I've done now, I wonder, was that Shiva? And when people have the idea of that people's near-death experiences are influenced by their beliefs, on the one hand, I get that and I understand that. I wasn't raised Christian, and I certainly wasn't exposed to anything Hindu. And so, by my perspective now, that man in the field was Jesus, and then I meet Shiva. How did that happen? East Coast white girl in Africa. It wasn't in India, I was in Africa.
I know, of course, Christians have moved to Africa, and of course, many Indians moved to South Africa, and even were, in many different ways. So I wonder if just the people who had passed on, the ancestors, or there was some little thread of connection just because you were in Africa, that maybe that's why Shiva was there, or why Jesus was there for you. It's interesting if it's tied to the history of the land.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is it my past lives, my karma? Is it already in the land? Those are good questions.
Yeah, interesting. So she kept you, the woman who found you, she kept you anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so she kept me hidden, and I've since found out because I have contacted one of her granddaughter. So her name is Lucy, and her granddaughter's name is Mayamu. And so I found out from Mayamu that they actually put shoe polish on me to help hide me. And so of course they dressed me as them, and they put shoe polish to make it so I was safer, and so it was safer for them also.
Wow.
Yeah. And so she was making arrangements for two things. One, she had one of the medicine singers from the land come help heal me since I was still recovering. And I had a lot of blindness in my right eye. I had a lot of structural functional body problems from having been shot and that being the second near death. I really couldn't see very well at all. And that occasionally comes back, but I can't really see out of my right eye that well. And so she was making arrangements also to find somebody who could speak to the white farmers across the river in South Africa who spoke Afrikaans and make arrangements. We found this white child, can we give her over to you so you can get her back to wherever she came from? So they took me across the Limpopo River and gave me to those white farmers. And what's interesting there is that it was such a cultural change that I went from being touched all the time and being sung to and eating together out of the same bowl and sleeping right up against other children. And it was just, I was so taken in. And so the shift to white Afrikaans culture, South African culture, was really quite painful for me. And that they were very, strong work ethic. They were there to do their farming. They didn't get any touch. I got fed well. There was running water. There was, a more comfortable bed. But I wasn't getting love. And I felt very much in the way.
And after a near-death experience, that's what a lot of people talk about, is how they're so sensitive to love. And that was, one of the messages that I heard is love is all that matters. And it really is all that matters. And so, that's a beautiful description of how you were missing love, and it didn't matter the quality of the bed, the energy, the quality of lacking in love is painful, I think, to us. It's even all the more painful after being that close to a loving God and that close to that connection. So you didn't have the language as a kid to realize that, but I'm sure in retrospect, you're like, of course I felt, the disconnect.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for articulating. I hadn't framed it that way for myself before. And then also they didn't gesture as much when they spoke. So I couldn't understand Venda and I couldn't understand Afrikaans, but Venda I could understand more because they gestured when they spoke and they were animated with their hands and their face. And so I could gather a whole lot more. But in that
cool. You just I use my hands all the time. And I was like, okay, I've got a reason to be proud of that. Thanks.
Right. Yeah. So I understood what was going on less, even though I was back with white people.
Wow.
And so I think at that point, the stress in my body, I just really couldn't keep going. And so I had what I now understand as parasympathetic shock, which is we go so dormant, like that we have the arousal state, which is the fight or fright. And then when we've had that extreme of trauma, we can go into what's called parasympathetic shock and go into no heart rate and no breath. So they hospitalized me because they found me, unresponsive. And I had actually crawled behind the refrigerator because at least I felt held and there was a vibration from the motor. And I wanted something feeling like it was living, touching me. And so that's, I think, where they found me, and then they hospitalized me. And then that was worse because this is South Africa. I'm in a whites only hospital. And I can't possibly speak of the love I just received from rural Black people. And they're telling me like, oh, it was so awful for you. And now you're back with white people and it's better. And that wasn't my experience at all. And so from there, they kind of intimidated me into telling them where I was from. And I was sent back, like a man escorted me on a plane back to the US. I was back with my family who...
And before we go back there, I do want to get a little bit into your trip. So did you see that hospital? Did you go to South Africa too? And so you traveled both to where the village was. And what was your impression now as an adult, like looking at the differences? Mm-hmm. Was it the same?
It was, like when we went, because we did the return trip last year, actually about a year to this month. And so just to kind of give context for that. So I was back with my family and there was like a culture of just don't talk about this. This never happened. We don't talk about it. It never existed. So I could never discuss any of it, being abducted or what happened in Africa. And so that's what I just repressed it all. And then I had to survive a lot more years of abuse until I got out at 19 and never went home again. And so, then flash forward 40 years later, I have John's loving support. People have helped me in this crowdfunder so I can go on this trip. And I didn't really know what I was going to find. We did make a connection with Mayamu, the granddaughter of Mayor Lucy. And I had like a 3-minute video of her describing my head wound. And so we knew it was really her. And so I went back and I found everything. We
Wow.
found, I did not expect to find the first hospital. We had no idea where that was, but that was in Bulawayo. And we found the land where the village was. We found Mayamu. The reunion of that changed my life. Literally, it was, running towards each other and hugging. And, I can't remember Venda, and she doesn't speak much English, so it was just this total complete union. And if people want to see that, there's I have my video where there's the clip of that at the end of my.
And how did it change you? I mean, just is it that affirmation that you long for, or that connection with that love that you spent a time in the book writing about, and then there's like no link? Was it that?
So it brought back that link. It completely blew away any self-doubt of like, maybe I'm remembering this wrong. And she's so loving. I mean, she almost picked me up off the ground. She's this strong, loving woman. And then she bent me forward and she checked the exact spot of what used to be my head wound. And the validation and the affirmation couldn't have come from anybody else. And it just completely healed, what had happened in my family when I came back of like, you're lying, none of this is true.
Oh, that's
And
so hard. I mean, you had this story to tell and you didn't get to tell it. I mean, that's, that really is, that's a tough one.
right. Yeah. Yeah. So when she fully embraced me, like there was a little thought in my head that just went through like, my family was so wrong. Like, and they miss out on knowing this love. And it's their loss. And I've tried with my one family member that has some potential, and she won't hear it. And, I even told her I was going. I even told her when I came back from Africa. She's not interested.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And, in moments like that, it's like the people that you lose, yeah, you've lost them, but God, you're gaining so many people who are interested in your story and just, cry and can't get enough of it. So it's really amazing. It's like, the payoff is this, huge audience that really, believes in you and is healed by hearing your story, because I think you're an inspiration that if you can suffer that level of trauma and get through it, then everyone who is suffering trauma and wondering about healing, I mean, you're this guiding star, this light for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. And what I want to say about that too is that healing is messy. It takes time. I spent my whole 20s and 30s doing trauma recovery work, and it's totally worth it. And that step by step, I could sense and feel my body again, which, increases your capacity for joy. And then if you're suppressing the pain, you're also putting a lid on the joy. And that to go ahead and deal with the pain, to walk through it and metabolize it and make meaning of it, makes it so I can feel love, I can feel joy, I can feel freedom, I can move. I was very rigid and stiff before I did my trauma recovery work. And step by step, my body got more freedom and options in my mind and my being. I choose so differently now than I did when I was 20.
That's the part that I think a lot of people freak out about, is walking through the pain. They kind of think, no, I've been through too much. I can't actually do that. Like that's where they get tripped up. And did you ever have moments like that where you thought it's impossible to walk through it?
Yes. Yes. And for as much healing as I did on the trauma from my family and in my neighborhood, there was a part of me that when I started writing this book, I thought, well, but the war stuff I'll never heal from. Like that's just done. That's just a mark in me that I can never recover from. And that's how I started writing the book, with that idea. And some of the really key things that have been transformative for me are doing the art. And I really am a big advocate of EMDR therapy, the rapid eye movement therapy. And because I'm so visionary, that's just a perfect match for my brain. And it's so much faster for me than talk therapy. And talk therapy too. And that body.
I agree. I totally agree.
Is essential. You can't. I had an herbalist, a teacher, say to me that trauma is not in the event, it's in your nervous system.
Yeah. And
There's always the past.
I don't even know if I could point to one thing because I tried so many things in trauma recovery. I mean, from, the first part was just anger and self-defense, but then it was, of course, energy work and psychotherapy and just a number of things, body work and releasing different things in different ways and, working with shamans, I mean, with so many different people, like, when I list everything that I've done, it's like, wow, it's a little overwhelming. It's a long list. And I
Right.
was like, well, where do I point? I think it became cumulative at some point,
Yeah.
that this loving attention to myself over time, eventually something snapped. And I was like, oh yeah, I'm really a lot freer. And oh, I'm walking through pain really quickly now. Do you feel like it was cumulative for you too, or?
Exactly. And in the beginning, it was like thankless work. I'd go to therapy, be so brave, work on some terrible trauma, and the next day I'd feel horrid because my body would be dumping all the toxicity and my skin would break out. And it was like, is this my prize? This. And so I can see why a lot of people think, oh, I'll stop there. And just what I want to say is keep going. Because in the beginning, it is terrible. Like all you get is just opening up Pandora's box. And then stay with it, stay with it. And having support and having others who are also walking it was really key for me. If I couldn't call up another abuse survivor and say, is your day totally sucked too? Oh yes, mine too. Okay.
Yes, and there's even
And
online groups that are great now too, like Lisa Romano for narcissistic parent, and so many different groups that people can connect
right,
with others.
right. And having that validation from others and seeing their progress gave me hope into my progress.
Oh, yes.
Seeing other people have breakthroughs in the group, then it gave me faith that I could have a breakthrough.
And energetically, I think we help one another too. And that's what I've realized, like working with energy workers and being around them, like that accelerates healing, just sharing these stories with each other. And I think even, maybe even possibly making videos like this, someone gets that little piece of healing's possible for me, and I know as a teacher and a professor, I always tried to extend my hand back, to people who are suffering and go, just take that first step, just walk into a recovery center or to a counselor's office or to something, that was needed for that person. So,
Right. And that's what I really, it's like I get invited to go speak at these places and it's such an honor and it's so healing for me. And I did Jeff Olson's event with Human Triumph. And people are thanking me for coming and speaking. I got to stand up from, in front of 100 and something people and share my story and be witnessed and validated by such a loving, grounded, heartfelt group. Like, how lucky am I? And that the healing is so mutual. And I want to tell you this piece. One of the women who came up and spoke to me afterwards, she was also an abduction survivor. And this blew me away, just survivor guilt. And for those who don't know what that is, it's if you made it out or you survived and other people didn't, it can do this crazy warp in your head to feel like you shouldn't have survived, or, it happens to like in, tornadoes or earthquakes or whatever. It's like, how come I stayed on the side that didn't break open and that person's gone? And then it's just really a very big process to heal that survivor guilt. And so she came up to me and she said, well, I was abducted, but I've always felt bad because people like you didn't get to escape. And for me, the FBI came in and broke up the whole child abduction and pornography ring before anything happened to her. And I thought, you feel bad about that? That's a lot of trauma. And so she told this to me, and then she was going to just kind of run away. And I took her hands and I said, just stay with me. And I could feel that like pain of her survivor guilt. And I just kept like pulling her closer. And I said, just stay with me. And because I'm an empath and because I can sense energy, I could feel she was working on flipping this over. And she did it. And I could feel this peace happen in her heart of getting rid of that distorted thinking that she should actually feel guilty for surviving that. And the healing that happened for both of us in that moment was profound, because it made all my work worthwhile. Because, honestly, there probably aren't that many abduction survivors who can get up and speak in front of a group about their experience. I'm sure there are others, but personally I haven't met them yet. And so for me to be that for her helped to like validate my power in terms of my healing. And then, you know, and it was just this unbelievable bonding moment between the two of us. And I thought, how lucky am I that I get to travel to Sedona and do this?
Yeah, you know, and as you're saying that, I'm going to loop back to something that really hit me. Yeah, a lot of trauma survivors and abduction survivors, they get some media now, you know, like if they've been held captive for a time and then they're just thrown into the media and you see them kind of recoil at times. I saw the movie Room, and even though it's fiction, you know, the way it is described afterwards when she's interviewed, you know, the questions were just so cruel and they just came at her in these awful ways. And I think she did it because, you know, she wasn't able to work and maybe she needed that money, you know, from the media attention. And it was just, I mean, it's just heartbreaking, you know, to think of how we treat trauma survivors and how we treat abduction victims. You know, it's all just, in some ways, you know, you didn't get that media attention, which might have been a good thing, even though you returned to this family. Like that might have shut down your story. You know, who knows what would have
Mm-hmm.
happened if there would have been a lot of. Was there any, or did your parents like shut it down completely?
Completely pretend nothing happened. Pretend
Wow,
everything on.
wow,
Yeah.
yeah. So interesting. So
And
the
I
healing.
want to make a point with that too, that the more I've done my healing work, the more I'm in my power, I get really good response. And like I just had a very well-known journalist contact me and we're having a lovely conversation, you know, and it's like he's super interested in near-death experiences and how can near-death experiences help people be less materialistic. And so
Yes.
because I've done my healing work, because I'm in my body, I'm really not experiencing. I mean, I had, you know, with my video, I had a couple strange responses, but I'm mostly getting support.
Yeah, and that's just YouTube. There's weirdos out there, trust me.
Yeah.
but but yeah, the to be in that place and to be able to tell one story, there is healing in that and connection with others, and that's a very powerful experience. And I think only more so you'll be in the minds of people. And I really do feel, and this is just me, but I feel that your story came into existence, and this is going to sound strange, before you wrote it. You know, it happened when it happened to you, and it was meant to be this book. And maybe your second near-death experience was alluding to that, you know, this is the piece that really the world kind of needs. Like, we need so much discussion around war and racism and religion and just healing from trauma, no matter what the trauma is. Like, this discussion is so necessary. Whatever piece people want to take from it, it's an important message. And so,
Right. Right. And that's what I've really been getting from the feedback I've been getting. And like we were saying earlier, you know, it can go so many directions. It can be about the near death, or it can be about war reconciliation, race reconciliation. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with Ishmael Beale. He wrote A Long Way Gone, and he was in Sierra Leone, and he was forced into being a child soldier. And just my dream is like, what if he and I can be on the stage together? And, you know, a child soldier now grown up and recovered, and me who was shot by a soldier who was young. And, you know, I don't know his life story, but who knows what he was forced into or where he came from, his background. But like, imagine that.
that sounds like a TED Talk video. That would be amazing. Yes. And
Yeah.
there's a piece I want to come back to about being an empath. Were you always an empath? Like, do you think from birth, you know, do you think that maybe the abusive family made you extra sensitive to what people were doing and feeling, or do you think it's developed more so over time?
That's a great question. So my perception is that as soon as I was born, I was like, like, sorry, I made a mistake. Let me hit the exit door. And so I feel that maybe my mom had a twin that died early on, and so her spirit stayed with me to accompany me through the uterine experience, through the womb experience. And so when she said, okay, you know, now my job is done, I'm leaving, I said, I'm coming with you. So, you know, kind of right off, I wasn't that I knew where the exit door was. And so whether that developed me as an empath, I'm not sure. I definitely was very practiced at reading adults to figure out what kind of crazy they were, what were they really capable of, and how was I going to play act to be what they needed me to be. Like, what kind of actress was I now with this crazy person or that crazy person, and I needed to switch back and forth between the two of them in the same room so I could survive. And so initially I was always looking for like the pathology in people and the psychosis in people, and was there any humanity left that I could appeal to? Was there some vulnerability I could find that I could relate to them so that my survival would increase?
And you didn't find that in your abductor, did you? You didn't find that moment of humanity.
That was what was so scary about him, is that for all the other pedophile adults I was exposed to, I could always find, their wounded child somewhere. With him, my belief is that he was a Vietnam vet. I don't know what happened to him. I know my sense is he had of severe abuse before that, and that going into being a soldier when you already have childhood PTSD makes people much more vulnerable to what they're like when they come out. People who go into it with a solid family experience or knowing who they are, they have more chance to be able to reconcile their PTSD when they come out, rather than having it be stacked up with layers of trauma.
And it's just amazing to me that you started this recovery when now PTSD is something that we talk about constantly, like not just necessarily with soldiers, but for people who are abuse survivors. But really that wasn't in the language in the 90s as much. It took a while for people to catch on, and for me to even realize that I had PTSD from childhood and a rape, like those two things and it was compounding, that certain things just become so comprehensive, and it also hits later too. So you can feel fine for a while, and then suddenly, like, I developed a phobia in cars. Like, I was of course very afraid at first, then I went through a time period where I was okay, and then it just came back. And that's the weird thing about PTSD is, it's not linear.
Right. And that people can do their high functioning, and then if they have kindness or they have a supportive relationship, sometimes that's when it comes up.
Yeah.
Where they have some security that says you can now go ahead and fall apart a little bit. And I just want to go back to your empath question. So I think I was beforehand, and then I had those near-death experiences.
Yeah.
That way upped my empath abilities. I did have some more as a teenage that was basically more the parasympathetic shock. Those weren't as significant. So I just think I had all these things to open me. And so now, and I think what's so interesting about being an empath is that means something different to a lot of people. And for me, it's really about people's health and their body and their emotional story in their body. And so that's the healing work I do with people, is I can really cut to the chase of like what's underlying cause for their health issues or their emotional distress, and really work with it at that very core level. And it's very gratifying work because can sometimes touch things for people they haven't been able to get to other ways.
Like, I feel everybody has that capacity, but they don't know that they have it. And it's weird. Like you can watch two people. There's a TED Talk video that's very interesting about how to spot a liar. And one mother killed her kids point blank, and she's talking about it. And then the other mother is just crying and addressing her daughter's killer in the courtroom, and you can feel that there's just nothing. There's just coldness in the first woman, and it just like hits you at the gut. And then there's just this pain and trauma and sadness, and you feel her emotions, the second mother. And I'm like, that's what being an empath is being able to pick up on the emotional bodies of other people. It's like not the words, it's not the intellect, but it's like, hey, what's coming out of their heart and their gut and their body, just like it hits some of us really hard. I think that
Right.
Reading, I guess, of people on that level.
And what's really interesting about that, my husband John has really studied the personality and people from a Myers-Briggs point of view, and that there really are people who are very sensory oriented, very tangible, very, those people tend to be more mechanical. They can solve a mechanical problem, days before I could even understand it. And so there is really a spectrum of people who are sensory to feeling and intuitive. And so I've come to really respect that. Of course, they have some aspect of intuition, but it may be not their first way of perceiving the world. Whereas
Yes.
for me, intuition is the very top way I perceive the world. And so
Yeah.
I can do intuition all day long and not get exhausted. Whereas to do something kind of this more tasky thing over here would tucker me out. So it's the
Yeah.
same thing for the people over here. For them to even conceive that I even have this much intuition is really hard for them,
Yeah.
because it's not their daily experience.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that is true. People are different, even artists and even healers. And, no matter who you are, that we are different within that realm. But yeah, my highest one is the N as well, as the intuitive. And of course, I'm an ENFP, so that perceiver part, man, that just makes me a wild thing. Like I'm intuiting things, and I'm perceiving things, and I'm just walking around like constantly, stimuli, stimuli, stimuli. And well, I think Walt Whitman, if I just had to guess, had to be that type, because he wasn't a very good worker. He just wandered through life, like, looking at the trees, looking at the flowers. And so certainly that intuitive piece is interesting, but it's what it's paired with too in Myers-Briggs that adds a lot. I think it was a dream therapist tell me to look at your weakness and really honor your weakness in the Myers-Briggs. And my weakness is menial tasks. So yeah, if I have to do like HR training, I feel like dying. Like I get sweaty palms, my head hurts. Like I'm like, I gotta look at a tree. So,
And I want to make a really good point with this. So near-death experiences happen to the full spectrum of like all the 16 types for Myers-Briggs. So from my type, which is already born intuitive, for me to have this visionary experience, it just added on to what I'm already good at. You flip that chart and you have somebody who's entire sensory. They're oriented towards, I get my answers from the past and from precedent. And, there's only the material world, and they have a near-death experience. It's their worst nightmare. It's their bottom of their stack. Their weakest areas is completely blown open. So for somebody who is that type, their integration of their near-death experience looks entirely different than somebody like me, who it's like, one more vision, great, So
interesting.
I
Yeah.
just really want to honor that. When John and I sat down and we looked at that, we actually designed a workshop for it to help people honor, like, if intuition is fifth in your stack of the 8 functions, it's going to be harder for you to integrate than if it was for me first, or for somebody who's in his third. And for somebody
Yeah.
who has the 8th in their stack, oh my God, they have to deny their experience, because
Interesting.
it doesn't work in their world, doesn't work in their paradigm.
Well, there are like I read Dr. Party's book about him. He sounded very materialistic, like incredibly materialistic, and everything switched, and he downsized his home, and the book is about that big switch. But I'm meeting more and more people who want to do career counseling with near-death experiencers, and that little piece that you're mentioning seems like an important piece, because yeah, you come back from this profound experience, and not everyone's given a direct mission like I was, like they just come back and they have to figure out what to do with their lives. And that's so hard, when everything has flipped. And I'm sure it's harder for someone who isn't naturally intuitive, like you're saying, like that. How do they figure it out? So that's an interesting part.
Right.
What's your workshop going into?
Well, I proposed it for the IONS conference, but it wasn't the one that got accepted. So, but I
Oh,
think John
darn.
and I will do it again. I should make a video on that with him,
Yeah.
in that conversation. That's a great idea. Thanks.
Yeah, cool. So, but it's helping people to determine how to integrate their near-death experience
Right.
based on their personality type.
Because John's super good. He can like get somebody's type in like 4 minutes. And then so to help them honor, like, again, like if it's 6th, 7th, or 8th in your stack, like you come back and your integration of your near-death experience is going to be, like Nancy Ryan's. She was a atheist, and she had to work on integrating her profound spiritual experience with her guide into that framework. And then everybody, thought of her. She had a science job, So her integration is a whole different ballpark than somebody who's, was already like a Reiki master or something like that.
Right. And now you're making me think like why it was so important to me right after surgery. I begged for a pencil and some paper because I was a poet. And I was like, it was all about the angels. I just started writing a poem about them. And I thought people may not accept this as reality, but you can get away with anything in a poem. And so, that was like my first, I mean, like still ICR, like bruises on my hands and I'm shaking, but I'm like, I knew I had to commit it to paper, because that was where my intuition and my creativity and my right brained things happen. So did you journal when you were a kid? Did you keep a secret journal or do anything to hang on to?
I had no safe place, no privacy, so
Wow.
I didn't write anything down. Like,
Wow. Hmm.
yeah, everything was invaded. I think I did have a tiny journal for a while, and my sister found it and announced it at the dinner table, all the contents. So I just didn't do that.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. And I switched to poetry because my mom read my journal at a young age and, then was very angry at me for the things in it. And I remember thinking, wow, you thought I was going to like you? And him, like, oh, you're such great parents. Love you so much. No, but that's really sad when privacy is invaded. Yeah.
Yeah.
So to sum all this up, was there anything that you think we left out in the telling of your story? Like, what do you think is one of the key pieces that you want people to take away from your story?
Well, I just want to go back to that list of ways of healing, and
Yeah.
that you and I've had this conversation about what we eat and what we put in our body. And so, if we're eating a lot of inflammatory food, a lot of foods that we're allergic to, we're just not going to have a very clear mind, and it's going to make the body and the mind and this healing way slower, if really possible.
Yeah. And
And
we
so,
live in such a polluted world.
yeah, and eating a clean diet, going ahead and spending a little more for organic, really prioritizing yourself. Like, we wouldn't put the wrong thing in our gas tank in our car and expect the car to run well. So why do we put the wrong thing in our body and expect it to do fine? So drinking clean water, eating clean foods, really prioritizing getting good nutrients, high density nutrient food, and what diet works for each person is so individual. But really getting away from the inflammatory foods like the fast food and the oils that have been heated a bunch of times with fast food, and getting back to whole food it's really quite simple. Just getting back to whole food, getting back to actually putting time into food preparation, because it's such a great self-love. It's such a great self-love.
It
And
is. It is. And I tell that message to my students. I just beg them to add more organic fruits and vegetables and raw if possible to their diet, no matter what they're doing, no matter what their income level is. Like if they can just add more of that as snacks and meals here and there, then they're beginning that process of adding more health into their lives. But, some people grow up in poverty that I teach and all they know is fast food and food banks and like it's a big switch for some people. I got into a big vegan conversation based on my last video and with someone and there's so much to the whole discussion of food that it depends on the person's disorder, their illness, where they are in life, where they are financially. Like so many things have to be taken into consideration, but I always think that the basics is exactly what you're saying. Stay away from processed, pick an apple over a bag of chips. Pick making your own food versus fast food. Always pick something that's healthier.
yep, and it's an investment in yourself, and it does take time and more focus.
Yeah, yeah. And it's a privilege, I think, to eat this way too. Like I'm reminded of it because I will pay $9, $15 for a salad bar, and I know my students at the same cafeteria can't pay that. They just can't. So they're going to eat the dollar taco or the, whatever is available. And so I think that's, a big push is to have more fresh food available in areas, especially like Texas, where it's not as prevalent. It's important for people in
Hmm.
their healing.
Yeah, and just kind of adding to that, like what I had worked on something in therapy for years. It was actually a survivor guilt piece, and I worked on it and did EMDR and did all kinds of things. And the thing that shifted it was when I was doing a month-long cleanse. And I was juicing every day. And I was
Mm.
walking in the woods, and all of a sudden, boop, it just shifted. So I
Yes.
just want to say food as medicine can be
Yes.
extremely powerful for people's healing.
Those cleanses are amazing. They
Yeah.
can be. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I so enjoy talking with you.
Yeah, me too. It's been beautiful, and I'm cheering you on and can't wait until I see that book with all the lovely art on the shelves. Do you know a date yet, or is that still in the works?
I'm hoping to turn it back into publishers the middle of next month, and then we'll see where I get a contract.
Cool. Awesome. Well,
And
thank
I
you
will
so.
see you at Ions in Bellevue.
Yes, yes. I'm excited to be there. So it should be lovely. Those national conferences are amazing.
Yeah. All
All
right.
right. All right. Well, good luck to you with all that you're doing, and I'll see you soon. And thank you for watching. And please like this video and subscribe and find Robin's channel and some of her other videos and the links below. But may you be blessed.